Happy to be back, always happy to be back in India, and I have been before at JNU, but never for such an event as the Shahab Tundra Memorial Lecture, and especially following people like Michelle Hassan and Yazam. I am both very pleased and humbled to be here today. And I thought I would talk about something which has occupied me for the past 6 years, that is really since about 2008. I have been engaged in a project trying to understand minorities, not in India specifically, but actually in other countries from which I think some of the lessons will apply in India. The two countries I have visited most often in Africa in the last few years have been Ethiopia and Egypt, and the countries I've visited in Southeast Asia have been the southern Philippines or Mindanao, and also Java and Sumatra in Indonesia. So I decided it would be best to hand out for you my lecture, so if you have this, you don't have it, you can get it. I will follow it mostly in order to go through and be able to finish in 40 minutes. It's allowed that I have some time for questions and answers. It's now 20 after, and that will make 5 o'clock. So let me just try and follow the outline and actually the content of what you have in front of you. So why do I focus on religious minorities? I don't need to justify it in this group, but it's a question that comes up very often. Why bother to study the Moros, that's the Muslims in southern Philippines, or why bother about Christians and Catholics in Indonesia? I should say, for those of you who've never thought about Indonesia, even though it's a very large Muslim country and has been influenced by many developments from India, they're not called Christians because it was a Dutch colony before it became an independent nation. And so the Christians are actually called Catholics and Christians. And Christians only refers to Protestants. So there are, let's say, 15 million, much smaller than the minority of Muslims, obviously, in India. But it's very important to them whether they're Catholics or Christians. To outsiders, it seems all like one religion called Christianity. But even so, it's very difficult to know how many Moros there are in the Philippines or how many Christians and Catholics in Indonesia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. I'm also going to talk about the fact that the majority and minority, even though these are difficult terms, they still maintain themselves for many people who are citizens in both the Philippines and Indonesia. And third, and probably most important, this is towards the end of the first page, I'm going to talk about nation formation. And nation formation is not something that happens once and for all, it's something that is a constant process. A process that one person described, looking at Indonesia, said, Indonesia is a nation, but it's a nation unfinished. That is to say, the process of building a nation still is to be done. And so what happens is you have specific profiles of religious communities that are subaltern. I don't need to explain that term in India, it came from India. Subaltern, that means whether they're majority or minority, whether Moros or Christians, Catholics. In Indonesia, they're considered to be smaller and less than those who dominate on the square. So if you turn to the second page, I'm going to talk about networks because that's my topic. Overseas immigrant networks, NGO networks, something we call them helping hands from abroad, and how these shape people's sense of nationalism, even when they no longer live in a country, but relate to it from overseas. So my very first slide here is to say the majority of Muslims, though they share ideals, they continue to live in borders and boundaries that are marked by surveillance and censorship, often pitting one Muslim nation against another. And this is because it often happens that there's a hyphen in the word nation-state. And while the paramount need is to define Cosmopolitan Islam from fundamentalist and Islamist, they also have nationalist rivals. That is, there are people who are not Muslim who also think about Islam as a difficult issue. This morning when I was at JNU, somebody said to me, what do you think of, my name is Khan, I'm not a terrorist. And I was introduced to Hindi film through that question. So my answer is that Khan is not a terrorist and neither is Ahmed, but there are statist nationalist opponents who often think that all Muslims are in some sense related to terror. I'll talk about that. how do you, despite the charge of terrorism or fundamentalism, project a larger cosmopolitan canopy that includes competing narratives of multiple Muslim actors? So, just to give you an overview, I say there are two different ways of thinking about this. One way is to think about it as if it is only a matter of what you believe, that to say if you have correct belief and practice, that somehow you are in a community that sets you apart. But you also have horizontal rather than vertical alignment, and that is with other groups that have a constitution, as we have in India a constitution, and that means that there are different symbols and systems to which you have loyalty. So there actually are always 5 groups. There's the state, which you can't avoid. There's the church, temple, mosque, and its hierarchy. But you also have media, that is not only the public media, but also not only the public media that's in print, but also media on TV. And you have courts, courts from the lowest level through the appellate level all the way to the Supreme Court. And then as well you have civil societies at home and abroad. And 2 things which people often ignore, but I think are extremely important, is global capitalism after 1989, when the Cold War ended, and there began to be a rivalry based not so much on identity as communist and capitalism, but on the notion that capitalism had prevailed, and so there began a great expanse of capital networks, if you will, after 1989. And then after 1994, of course, the internet. So most of you in this room are quite young, certainly younger than I am, and you might be defined as belonging to the millennial generation. And when people ask me, what is the millennial generation? I say it's not whether you were born after 2000, it's whether you were born after the internet. So actually the millennial generation started a little earlier, started in 1994, not 2000. So those who are 20 years older, or a little bit less, a little bit more, are part of the millennial generation, not just because of the calendar, but because of the internet. And I must say I have children, I have daughters who complained to me that after 1994 they never received a letter. And I said, well, I kept sending you emails. And they said, yes, but it's not the same as a letter. And so I imagine that those of you who are millennialists send a lot of emails, receive a lot of emails, but write and send or receive very few written, handwritten letters. It's like the horse's buggy. After the car was invented, people still rode horses, but they prefer to ride cars. So, for minority citizenship, what this means is, who has the memories? What memories are they? What experiences do they reflect? And then how does the state, I'm sorry, misprint gentlemen, the central state, not 18, how the central state and its supporters, the local community and its defenders define history. So for instance, when I was this morning at this other event at the gentleman Lydia, the Zakir Hussain Institute, one of the questions was, how do you think about history, Muslim Hindu? And one of the great questions is, do you have textbooks that decide it? Do you have various online groups that argue their history over against others? Or is it a public space where people debate history? All these exist in the present day. So what I want to do is to take you to the Philippines and to show you how this works in terms of an actual part of the world that's very important that mostly does not get studied. So one of the things you may notice, even though you've heard of the Philippines, is the weather reports. Even though I'm in India, I listen to the weather reports. I'm always curious to see what's happening elsewhere in the world. And even on Indian TV, when they have weather reports for Southeast Asia, they show the Philippines and they only show the top island. In other words, they only show Luzon, this place that's way up here to the north. And very few come all the way down to the south and include Mindanao. But it's this island, a large island, it's actually bigger than northern Luzon. It's called Mindanao. It's in Mindanao where you have the largest Muslim community in present-day Philippines. But in terms of history, I saw it on my paper, but I should just say briefly, Islam has been in the Philippines since at least the 13th century. Not as long as India, but in a sense also from Indian traders and people who have gone across the Indian Ocean and settled the Philippines. And in the 14th century, there's actually a document that talks about the Sultanate of Manila. People say, well, that's a Roman Catholic place. Yes, the Roman Catholic after the 16th century. So the preceding 3 or 4 centuries, that is over 300 years, there were Muslims in the Philippines. They were the dominant group. Before the Catholics came, they controlled much of the politics of the Philippines. And so there was a Sultanate of Manila. That's all been left aside in the last 40 years. And Muslims have gradually receded to the south. And now the only place where they have majority in some places is Mindanao. And even all of Mindanao is not qualified as Muslim. So what you have is you have a group called the Moros. And the Moros are a very interesting group. They're a group with a lot of tensions among themselves about which group, that they speak at least 4 different major languages. So who defines their community? Which one of these languages? What are the choices they have between what is said by the leaders and what individuals want to do? And also, if they think about themselves as a group, what are their rights against that of the other people who are Christian and Catholic, but not always agree on how they view each other or view minorities? So the major situation, which I think I support wholeheartedly, is how do you talk about this in a way that reflects the actual values that people have there. And instead of looking at European scholarship, I actually go to a Japanese scholar, Shinzo Maesi, who is from actually outside Tokyo. He's a very interesting historian who's written extensively about the Philippines. And he says that the crucial thing to note is that Southeast Asia is a maritime zone. He calls it the East Maritime Southeast Asia, EMSA. So he said instead of talking north-south, which you had in that map where you saw Luzon in the north and Mindanao in the south, he said let's think about the Philippines as always being engaged to the west. So as I said, it was Indian traders, it's a lot of commerce as well as ideas that went across the Pacific Ocean. And so this Japanese scholar says, instead of thinking of the Philippines as north-south, going from Luzon to Mindanao, think of it going from east to west. And if you do that, you find there's a lot of interaction with many traders from Southeast Asia, but also South Asia, especially India. And he says, if you only emphasize Islam as a religion, you miss that there's much there besides Islam. And what is it? He says, an open society. An open society where networks crisscross across all the boundaries and where alien behavior is a norm rather than periodic warfare. So this is a very important thing to realize when you look at the Philippines. First of all, it's not always been Catholic. At one point it was dominant Muslim. And secondly, even though Muslims are now part of only the South, they still connect to East Maritime Southeast Asia described by this scholar. So he says the important thing is, as I've already mentioned this, the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in a setting of peaceful everyday life. In other words, in this maritime world, it's an open society where networks might cross boundaries and where alien behavior, not warfare, was the norm. Now I've been mentioning a lot of facts. Let me mention one person beyond Cynthia Hayesi, who's an important scholar. This man, Theodore Friend, sometimes known as Dory Friend, is like me, an American academic. But unlike me, he spent most of his life in or writing about Southeast Asia. And so one of his books, Theodore, or Dory Friend as he's known, he says we have to rethink the entire archipelago, not just the Philippines, but Indonesia, as water-connected islands, not a single landmass. And he says it's easy to say it, but how do you put it on a map? He says, first of all, think about it not as the Philippines and Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore. All these are nation states. But think about it as the Phil-Indo-Archipelago. In other words, Phil-Indo-Archipelago. Philippines, Indonesian archipelago. This would be a nation. And if it's a nation, it would be the 3rd largest in the world after China and India. That is, it would be even bigger than the United States. Even though the United States now has a population of 317 million, this would be an area that's more like 450 to 500 million. And this is the map. I'm sorry, actually it came out better for you than for me. So if you see all this that is in yellow, it goes here all the way across to Papua and then all the way up to the Philippines. All these islands, they're yellow, except this one place here, Timor, which of course East Timor became was under Portuguese rule and is now an independent country. But all the rest of this is part of what would be described as the Philippine Indonesia or the Phil-Indo archipelago, where people share many things in common. In fact, Professor Friend finishes this very interesting study by saying that wherever majority politics evoke minority resentments, they always have incomplete assimilations. That is, there are unitary visions where everything has to be one language, one country, one religion, and these produce contradictions because no nation is signalized by language or religion or by culture, and what often happens is unsuccessful secession movements or random bloody divisiveness. So in his place, what he advocates, this is Professor Friend and I also advocated, is sort of a site for information, discussion, contesting ideas, obviously political struggle and organization, all takes place, but it's under the guise of media and now cyberspace, as well as face-to-face interactions of everyday life. In other words, second quote, the public sphere has become the place where arguments about local identity and nation formation should, can, and do take place. But it doesn't mean they always take place fairly. So I use two metaphors to describe what happens and what needs to be changed in the Philippines and Indonesia. The first I call top-down, centrist-ruled, elite-privileged nation-state polities. And I describe these as in Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines, Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, you have a major metropole, and a major metropole provides other things. So, for instance, the total Philippine population is 90 million, but 2 million live in Metro Manila, while 20 million live in Greater Manila. That is about 1/6 of the whole population lives in or is related to the capital city. In Jakarta, the numbers are also striking. Of an estimated 240 million Indonesians in 2014, almost 143 million, or close to 60,000, live on the island, with 10 million living in Jakarta itself. So the cities, the capital cities, have a disproportionate role in the life that goes on in the rest of the island and the rest of the country. And also there are political developments under colonialism. As I said, the Americans controlled the Philippines for part of the 20th century until Philippine independence happened in the last half of the 20th century. And they mostly were top island, that's Quezon, where Manila is, and less of Mindanao. And the Dutch, of course, focused in Java, which is this tiny island, which you'll see in a moment, and not with the rest of Indonesia to the same extent. So, 2014, what we have is a situation where Moros in Mindanao, as well as their counterparts, the Catholics, which are Catholics and Christians in Indonesia, have become marginal minorities. In other words, they're defined by location rather than by ethnicity or religion, and mostly as second-class citizens in nation-states that never lose their hyphenation. Let me pause and emphasize this physicist scholar Vicente Rafael saying, it's an historical conundrum that the nation is colonized by the state. In other words, the state is supposed to be the reflection and the advocate for the nation, but what happens is the state colonizes the nation, and so the hyphen evokes something that's together but also obscures what's not together. So the nation hyphen state is an actual historical conundrum. That means it's a contradiction because the nation and the state do not lie one with the other. So both Moros, who are minorities in the Philippines, and Christians, minority in Indonesia, they share membership in a nation state where boundaries between state and nation uncomfortably lie. And what are the gaps? So I want to talk a little bit about the gaps. I'll do, first of all, the Philippines and then Indonesia. So what you have is, as I said, the center is Manila. It's a Roman Catholic ethos. It supposedly prevails in all of the Philippines, but it excludes the very important Muslim minority, the Moros in the south. There's also censorship, which limits people finding out what happens in different parts of the Philippines, especially in the south. And there's also not a vibrant public square which can be sustained and accessed by all people. And what you have is many institutions that represent and they also protect their views and contest each other, but they often do it at the local level for local constituencies. And I summarize all this by saying instead of a panacea, what you have is the Catholic panacea feel the captain means everybody talks and nobody understands each other. So what is the future? I described this from one scholar, a British scholar, Max Lane, who was looking at Indonesia, and he uses the word in Bahasa Indonesia, pegalan. Pegalan means a national revolution of social norms, but the change comes not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Pegalan. And this involves civil society. So what you have in the Philippines since 1986, these are a lot of third parties intervening, advocating peace. But despite the best efforts of these many agents, the powers to decide still rest in Manila, what's called Metro Manila, the people who have not and often will not feel the consequences of their decisions. She observed this in 2006, 2003, by the way. That's a very good website, c-r.org. If you want to find out much more than I can say in a brief lecture about the Philippines, just go to hwc-r.org. You'll find out a lot more about how different people are trying to resolve issues in the Philippines. And just for pictures and amusement, because art is part of life, here's a Catholic institution in Cotabato, which I visited. It shows a strong man and another person trying to hold up this vast array of people. And you see the crosses there. There's also the Muslim crescent. You can see all the way up there. So it's a kind of public mural that tries to say, yes, we can all live together. And there I am. Actually, this is 6 o'clock in the morning. It's a very early radio show where I was present with this particular fellow. And the people all standing behind are Mindanao or Towson Muslims. And the people in front, one is a Chinese woman, the other is a Roman Catholic priest, and the other person is me. And here's a manpower training center, which is mostly targeted for minorities. It was called ARMM. Notice the name. Republic of the Philippines at the top, and then Autonomous Region Muslim Mindanao, ARMM. And then here's Islamic Bank, which is part of the development bank. In other words, Islamic banking exists in Indonesia, in the Philippines, as it does many other places, but it's a subset or subsidiary of the Development Bank of the Philippines. So here's what we have, just to end on the Philippines. We have the public square, which should operate to further the rights, the human rights of everybody, including in this case the minorities. But it's often co-opted, that is to say it's used by people who want to say they're Democrats, but whose tactics suggest that they are not. And so Philippine Muslims catch themselves in a very difficult situation. It's called English catch-22. On the one hand, they want to advocate the government. On the one hand, they want to oppose some of its policies. And so the prospects for anything involving full citizenship rights in the near future are very limited. Now let me turn to a little bit happier story in Indonesia, where I've also spent a lot of time in the last 4 years. Notice how immediately you said going east, instead of going north and south as you do in the Philippines, you go from west to east. So you move all the way from Malaysia, and you can see Sumatra, which is the biggest island, and it doesn't have Banda Aceh, but if you went all the way up here, you would come to Banda Aceh, which is a small Arab enclave. All this is part of a large commercial archipelago, but the biggest island is here in part of Bandung, and Surabaya, and then this is a little island like Bali out here. And then of course you can see Indonesia goes all the way down out here. So there's a huge number of islands. It's not a single landmass as in South Asia or the Republic of India. It's many, many islands. And when you look there, you begin to see why that creates a different feeling than we have in India, or for that matter, in Europe or the United States. Indonesia is the most complex Afro-Asian nation when you consider citizenship, religious citizenship, or minority rights, because it's so remote. I should say, if I say to some people in the United States, I'm going to go to South Asia, they say, oh, you mean Southeast Asia? And I don't know how many of you have ever encountered this with Americans, but Americans know Southeast Asia because of the Vietnam War. So when you say, I'm going to South Asia, you say, oh, you mean you're going to Vietnam? No, South Asia. And you almost have to say it very loud. South Asia is not Southeast Asia. And you may think that's confusing. It is, but it's also very sad. Many people think that Indonesia is very remote, beyond Vietnam, way out in Southeast Asia, and certainly not related to India or South Asia. And Java, with 17,000, is just one of 17,000 islands, but it's a key to thinking about Indonesia in its capitalist part. So brief facts, which probably most of you know when we repeated. I said 240, some people say 250 million. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world after China, India, the United States, I said, with over 300 million, and Indonesia was somewhere between 240 and 250 million people. So these are the four largest countries in the world. And about 80% of Indonesians are Muslim, so that's 210 million Muslims. And even though I've heard various estimates of how many Muslims are in India from 12% to 20%, let's say it was 20%, there would still only be 200 million Muslims. So there'd still be 10 million more in Indonesia. But the point is that it's a very large Muslim country. In fact, it counts the worldwide population of Muslims is 1.25 to 1.5. It's either 1/5 or, if you will, 1/6 of all Muslims in the world. Christians are a minority, and notice that still means they're a large minority because there may be 16 million Protestants and 5 million Catholics. That's over 20 million people who are Christians and Catholics. And they share space, public space, in a country described as modern, pluralist, and secular, which sounds like also the label that's put on India, modern, pluralist, secular. And law and tradition are supposed to protect minorities, but often everyday practice in national politics do not. So let me just cap a couple of points about Indonesia. Islam is supposed to be the majority religion, but it's not Arab Islam, it's Island Islam. The Holy Quran in Arabic occupies a special place. In fact, it's said that there are more reciters of the Quran in Indonesia than any country in the world, but it's qualified as Malay culture. So here you have islands, just to give you a sense of the water, Island Islam. This is Yasin. For those of you who are practicing Muslim, you know Surah Yasin, which is always said in Janazah, human rights, and here it is, written actually on a kind of goat skin, but one that's been finely tuned and with Abu Bakr Usman around the side. And then you have the Yasin and the Basmala at the top. And so the islandness of Indonesia is very crucial when you think about Muslim-Christian relations. I described a debate about religious space, people debated, and ironically, it was not the Catholics were the majority, but the Protestants who said they didn't like the bill because they saw it as a danger to religious freedom. But the largest Islamic university, Islam in Yasin, said no, it's fine to have one that protects religious freedom, religious space bill that defends it. And so there are ongoing debates between Protestant Catholics and Muslims. Now, even though that debate is unsettling, I want to say something positive about it. How many countries, you can answer this or ask me this question afterwards, how many countries can you imagine where we could have a national debate about religious space? I've been to Saudi Arabia, you couldn't have it in Saudi Arabia. I've been to Iran, you couldn't have it there. I've also been to Nigeria and Sudan, the impossible. Pakistan, Bangladesh, you know the answer. So I've tried to think of other countries where I've been, where you could have a debate about the use of religious space in public. You might have it in Jordan, or possibly Morocco, or Tunisia. But their populations, think about it, Jordan is less than 10 million. Morocco is maybe 25 million. Tunisia is about 8 million. These populations are much smaller than the 250 million people in Indonesia. So there is pluralism. I want to say very emphatically, there is pluralism in Indonesia. Educational structures, metropolitan universities have promoted. I myself was privileged to be a Fulbright teacher and leading the Islamic University education in 2006. But behind the scenes and out of sight are often tug of war between people who think the country is becoming Christianized or people who are the Christian side theory is becoming Islamicized. The crucial period is the one of Suharto. In other words, the founder was Sukarno, for those of you who don't know Indonesian, Sukarno, 1945 to 65, Suharto, 66 to 98, and then for the last 15, 16 years, it was called the Reformation. So Sukarno, Suharto, Reformation. During the period of Suharto, which ended in 98, there was always a zero-sum game about religious discourse. In fact, the state seemed to like the fact that people fought each other so they could act as a broker. And people were divided into two groups, inclusivists, exclusivists. Who were the inclusivists? They wanted to have a big public square in Jakarta. They wanted to argue tolerance and also cosmopolitanism as something intrinsic to Java and Indonesia as a whole. But at the same time, there's the issue of how do you equally protect places of worship and give everybody equal right to worship. And this is true not only the problem between Muslims and Christians, but it's also a problem because of outside forces. This is called, remember I mentioned the internet. Since '98, of course, the internet has been very active all over the world, including Indonesia, and there are many websites that agitate rather than just advocate for a particular perspective. And NGOs, even though they're very attractive to Indonesia and see it as an important place, often also hide missionary activities, that is, they claim to be operating in a secular or balanced way, but also some of them have missionary, often Protestant Christian agendas in mind. So here's what you have in Java and Mindanao. You have minorities in both cases. One is Muslim in Mindanao, and Java is Christian. You have to look at the size of the community. You have to look at the religious markings. It's presumed, for instance, that all Moros have the same national heritage, common outlook. They don't. And belonging is no more secure there than it is in Indonesia. In Indonesia, there's a convergence about a collective memory of fighting the Dutch, achieving independence. By the way, also fighting the Japanese. I'm doing this very rapidly so I didn't have a chance to mention the Japanese occupied Indonesia for almost 6 years prior to and during World War II. And if there's a resentment, which there is in China, about the Japanese invasion during World War II, it's equally strong in some parts of Indonesia. Whereas, by the way, there's a strong, very small Chinese minority as well. The code or ideology of Indonesia is Pancasila. It's supposed to integrate everybody within the island, but in fact, it often happens that it's a top-down rather than a bottom-up process, as it is in the Philippines. And so, the conclusion is the one that I take from a friend of mine who's an Indonesian scholar, who says, just as the intelligentsia continues to be the political elite, it's in their hands that the future of our nation resides. And so he says it's time for the intelligentsia, the people who are elites, to unite in a common historical calling to serve and save the nation. It's a wonderful motto. It's a great goal, but it has not yet been achieved. So at the end, you have a census. People still take a census, wondering how many Moros out of the Philippines, how many Christians have in Indonesia. I think there's as much symbolic as numerical power to say minority, majority. And I want to quote just briefly a man named Talal Asad. He's a very fine scholar, a friend and colleague of mine in America. And he says we should abolish all majorities and instead have everywhere a model nation of minorities. In other words, everybody, no matter how numerous or how few they are, everybody has a status of being a minority. As much as I respect the ideal, I think it's unattainable. I think there will always be majority-minority identities. Majority as well as minority retain a level of religious literacy about the others, and sometimes they look at the public square not as a place to debate, but as a place to prove themselves successful and abolish others. So am I hopeless? No. I think that you can hear voices, you can see views debated, and you can gauge the future of Moros in the Philippines and Christians in Indonesia. But you have to also look at helping hands from abroad. There's people who are involved in NGOs that are actually balanced and not extremists in their view. And Benedict Anderson has coined this term long-distance nationalism. So you can have people who are immigrants overseas through networks influencing people in their countries of origin, and often these confer their citizenship rights. So I think at the end, what you have is that Muslim minorities, like their Christian counterparts, Muslim minorities in the Philippines, like their Christian counterparts in Indonesia, must strive to be equal in piety and loyalty to people who are majority patriots, even though there are many factors that strain without so far breaking that twin allegiance. Thank you. So let me try and answer them. Actually, I'm not even answer them in reverse order. I will get back to the exploitation, which we started with. So let me answer this. As I said, I lived in Indonesia, and I agree there is debate among those people majority, but there's also extensive debate between majority and minority minority because in the larger paper, which I hope you have a chance to read, I also talk about the Chinese. So the Chinese are actually, for me, one of the crucial elements of Indonesia that I don't want to say that they're like the Sikhs in India, but in a sense, every time somebody asks me about Hindu, Muslim in India, I don't want to say, what about the Christians? I want to say, what about the Sikhs? Because last time I checked, there's also a very strong Sikh minority in India, and when you just reduce it to talking about Hindu, Muslim, you leave out the agency, but also the influence and importance of a very strong Siddharthi community. So in a slightly parallel way, in Indonesia, people say, oh, it's an issue of pluralism, and I'm going to talk about the way in which that can be a mistake to only accent pluralism. Just on majority-minority, the debate, which has really been going on only, I want to emphasize this, only since 1998. In other words, people say, oh, but Indonesia was independent in 1945. And if you've not been there and not looked at the history, you wouldn't realize that 45 to 65, for 20 years, it was a military state where only Pancasila, that is to say, a very secular slogan, could be invoked in public. There could be religion, but not religious debate. There was religious membership, religious loyalty, but not religious debate. And then from 65 or 66, there's a transition period of almost a year, let's say 66 to 98, under a second military ruler, Suharto. So Sukarno was the first, and then Suharto, both the military men, both privileged by virtue of that background, but also limited by it. The only kind of state advocacy was one that supported Suharto's notion of pluralism. So yes, on the question of is pluralism only a debate by the majority used to enforce its rule, I have several examples in the larger paper where I show how pluralism or majority was invoked, but only for the benefit of the few, not the many. So the misuse or abuse, if you will, of this majority-minority rubric is extant in Indonesia from 65 or 66 through 98. And then this strange thing has happened since 98. You all know that there has been a very bad downturn in the economy in 2008. But those of you who are young enough probably don't remember that in 1998, there's also a huge downturn in the economy, especially for Southeast Asia. And Indonesia was more badly affected than Malaysia. So just a little more than 15 years ago, the huge downturn, that's the reason, not because of ideology, but because of a bad economy, that there was a replacement as a part of the Reformation. And it's only over the Reformation period of the last 15 years that you have had real debate about majority-minority, with minority participating. And I gave the instance about religious space. I could have given also the instance about different forms of allotment from the government, but I just limited it to one case. So I think your question, the last question, is that it can be only majority among themselves and minorities don't have a voice. That would apply to the first 40 years of Indonesian history, since independence in 45. But the last 15 or 16 years, I would argue there has been a genuine kind of public space, and maybe I can come to this comment about public space, which I think is a very interesting comment. Is there such a thing as public space? And does it count in a Habermasian sense? This is question number 4. I'll get back to 5 and 6. Question 7 was about majority-minority. Question 4, is there genuine intersubjectivity, which is required in a Habermasian notion of public space? That's a very important, sophisticated question. I hope most of you understand where it comes from. And Habermas theorizes as the condition for a liberal, capitalist, democratic society. But my criticism in a larger version of this paper is he's only talking about Europe. Habermas may be a very great theorist, but he's never traveled very much outside Europe or North America, which is kind of Europe on the other side of the pond. In other words, the part of the world that's really important for his theory, Africa and Asia, including South Asia, is never mentioned, and it was never a place that he visited. So the Habermasian intersubjective public square or public sphere has not been examined closely or well in South Asia. And I think this particular book that was cited, Being Muslim, I know, I've read lots of books, and I usually am pretty up on the reading. The only person I can think of who's written being Muslim, this wasn't John Esposito, who you beat 2014. But who was the author?
Robin Jeffrey. Robin Jeffrey.
Robert Jeffrey.
Yes, Australia.
Oh, so from India.
Australia.
Oh, Australia. Robert Jeffrey from Australia. But Robert Jeffrey from Australia is also a friend of William Dalrymple.
Yes, he cannot be in his papers.
Yeah, but he also is connected to William Dalrymple.
Yeah.
I want to make sure it's the same chapter. I think it is. I think I answered my own question. So, I would say, and it's not that I don't believe that Australian scholars and Muslim scholars in Australia need to be listened to, but the Australian take on pluralism is very different because of its relationship more to England than it is to India. And, you know, there's some criticism of the book City of Jinn. I do not remember where he talks to Jackie. The last part of the book is all discussion between them, because it all presupposes a certain British notion that religion is in the private and politics is in the public. And there isn't a great discussion about debates on religion that go on in public. So I think the great difficulty is it has a, not a prejudice, but let me say a presupposition, a bias, maybe not a prejudice, but a bias towards thinking of what it is to be Muslim as a private rather than a public thing. So anyone who's a Muslim publicly verges on being an activist, to get back to this term, fundamentalist, extremist, the kind of terms that are used to say, if you're Muslim in public, then you violated the kind of liberal agenda of the liberal pact that says, thou shalt be religious, but only in private. And I think this is what fails to do. I will, by the way, read the book. Now you told me I should, I will. And if I disagree with it, I will let you know. But I really have a big question with cosmopolitanism as something that only applies at a certain level. This is the fifth question. If Muslim cosmopolitanism may be an oxymoron. By the way, I told you about my daughters and the fact that they disagree with, they don't like the fact that they haven't received any letters from their father since 1994 because I only send emails, occasionally postcards, no letters. So, in the same way when I told them about this project to explore Muslim cosmopolitanism, they said, it will work because when you say Muslim, most people think terrorist. At least my own family, my daughters. I said, you don't think that. They said, no, we want to believe something else, but all the headlines are if you're Muslim, you're terrorist. So, when I talk about Muslim cosmopolitanism, I don't say it's an oxymoron. I say it's like Sisyphus. That's the ancient Greek hero who found himself at the bottom of a hill and he had to push the boulder to the top. And I sometimes feel as if I'm pushing a boulder called Muslim cosmopolitanism to the top. And sometimes I feel very tired, and sometimes I feel that I still have to keep pushing because I do think there is a Muslim cosmopolitan ideal and even some practitioners. And another version of this talk, which I was going to give and decided not to give it and focus on Southeast Asia, I mentioned one person who for me embodies in present-day India a notion of Muslim and cosmopolitan, and that is the the painter, the artist Mahmoud Fida Hussain, otherwise known as M.F. Hussain. And you might say, oh, but he was an elitist, he came from Mumbai, he was in the Bollywood clique. He came from a very poor family in Maharashtra. And he learned, in all of his early life, he just did street paintings. And then he became famous because he joined a group of progressive artists in Mumbai, and eventually, through luck, he became a famous artist. But, as you know, in the 90s, people rejected him because he painted Hindu subjects. He's a Muslim, and he painted Hindu subjects, including goddesses without clothes, which is the way most times they're depicted. But he got in trouble for doing this, and he had to leave, as you know, he had to leave India, and first went to Dubai, and then I met him in Doha. But he always said to me, civilizations are bigger than their enemies. Civilizations are bigger and stronger than their enemies. And he said, there is such a thing as Muslim. I asked him, do you think if there is such a thing as Muslim cosmopolitanism? He said, yes, it relates to Arab civilization, but it is stronger with Persian, and I like it best at Google. So he said, yes, there is such a thing as cosmopolitan, It relates to the Arab past, the Arab beginnings of Islam, and Arabic as a language of the Holy Quran. But he said Persian expresses it in poetry, literature, and sometimes in history, but Urdu, for him, embodies it in the modern period. So I think of him as being a binational person. He was both Indian and later Catholic, and somebody who speaks in many different idioms, and he represents through art a vision of the Muslim cosmopolitan ethos. And now I had three other questions that I didn't answer. One of them, which I thought was very important, are there such things as Muslim cosmopolitan networks? So if I argue, as I do, against my own family, and maybe against some of you here in this audience, that it's not an oxymoron, it's not a contradiction to talk about Muslim cosmopolitan. The difficulty is to always thread the narrative, to say it can't happen in abstract, it has to happen with particular people, particular places, and particular histories. But I do think there are individual Muslim cosmopolitans and also Muslim cosmopolitan networks. So let me give you one example of a Muslim cosmopolitan network that's online. In other words, you can all leave this, or even do it if you happen to be able to do it in this room. And I'll just give you one instance of this. It's called Islam Awakened. Not Islam Awakes or Islam Awake, but Islam Awakened. One word, Islam, and then Awakened, Awakened. And if you go on that website, you think, oh, this must be very traditional because it talks a lot about Arabic, and it says you have to compare all the different versions of the Quran, the Holy Quran. It gives 35 translations, not one or two or three, but 35 translations of the Holy Quran from Arabic into English. But it says what you have to decide is not what is your creed, what is your confession, not the Shahada, or not your Fara'id, your practices, whether you do Zakat, the Hajj, the Saum, or whether you fast or don't fast during Ramadan. The real issue is how you think about Tawheed. And it says Tawheed, and it's almost as if it's quoting the Salafi scholar Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, except it says something very differently. It says you have to believe in God, but then you also have to believe that God is alive today, and not just simply in the past. So Allah, or God, or Khullah, they use all these terms. It's not something from the past. It's not only in a holy book, it's also in the present century. But then it says something very much more interesting. It says there's not only Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah and Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, there's also Tawheed Sifati. And if you go back and look at Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he uses these same three terms, but he completely forgets the third one. He says, Sifatiyya, which is, for those of you who know a little bit about Islam, the Asma al-Husna, the beautiful names of God, is known. These names, you can only have one name, Allah Ta'ala. But the whole history of Islam, there's been the notion that it's in the Quran itself, there's Asma al-Husna. Not one name, not the Ism Izan, but the Ism Sifat. And so, for me, I'm not Muslim, but I think that there actually is a Muslim cosmopolitan ethos that's in the Holy Quran, and it comes from this one word, Dhul Jalal wal Ikram. So one of the 99 names, Asma al-Husna, is Dhul Jalal wal Ikram. And people look at that and they say, oh yes, it only comes up to one surah, Surah Al-Rahman, for those of you who know the Quran, the Surah Al-Rahman, 55. But it's really crucial because it comes up as a way of describing how inscrutable but present God is. And God sometimes seems to be doing things that hurt people, even people, especially the people who believe in Him, the Muslims, and that is Jalal. But Jalal is always followed by Ikram. So there's never Jalal by itself. There's always Jalal wal Ikram. And it's not the reverse. It's not Dhul Ikram wal Jalal. It's Dhul Jalal wal Ikram. So I think there is, in this Muslim website, but also in others, something I would call cosmopolitan. Now, two final questions. Actually, the first questions. The second one had actually 3 or 4 parts of it, but one of them I understood was how relevant is the whole notion of Southeast Asia for South Asia, and how does it affect the ideology of Muslim youth? I debated whether or not to talk about Southeast Asia. I thought maybe some of you thought about it, but you've never probably visited Jakarta or Java or even Bali. And it might be too obscure, and I'm sure that most of you have not visited the Philippines, the southern Philippines. But because the Indian Ocean is called the Indian Ocean, because the Indian Ocean, and this lecture is dedicated to a name, Shahapando, who's from Kerala, and Kerala goes back to Hadramaut. And so, in another version of this lecture, I would say it starts from Arabia, but not from Saudi Arabia, from Hadramaut, which is the south of Arabia, which is present-day Yemen. And above all, from Tarim, a holy site in Yemen, which I had the privilege of visiting. And so from Tarim, if you go across the Indian Ocean, you don't stop in India. You keep going from Kerala, Ujjain, to Sri Lanka, all the way out to, as I said, Banda Aceh, and then to further places. So if you think of Islam, not north-south, but west-east, the Indian Ocean, which is called Indian because it starts in Arabia, it goes through India, out to Indonesia. It seems to me this is the heart of the Cosmopolitan network of Islam. So for instance, when people say to me, well, how would I find out more about this? And I say, read in an antique land. You mentioned being Muslim. I would say, to my mind, if that particular writer, which I haven't read yet, doesn't mention In an Antique Land by Amitabh Ghosh, who's not Muslim, by the way. He's a Bengali Hindu. Have any of you ever heard of this book before?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I would say that is an embodiment of the Muslim cosmopolitan ethos. And it covers the Indian Ocean because this person goes from India, but he doesn't go east, he goes west. He's known as Al-Hindi because he studies in Cairo. He wants to find out something about the ancient history of Islam. And he finds it out by going to Geniza, and it's this wonderful tale of discovery. But the biggest discovery is not in manuscripts, it's in people. And he finds that people between Cairo and India and the Indian Ocean, and by the way, Kerala comes up very large in this novel, which is also a historical novel. All these trading relationships are amiable. That is, they connect people who have common interest in exchange of ideas and goods. They are not warfare. Does warfare happen? Of course. But it's the exception rather than the norm. So in my understanding, the Indian Ocean is bigger than India, bigger than Arabia, bigger than Southeast Asia. But precisely because it connects all of them, as Amitabh Ghosh shows in An Antique Land, it's important sometimes not to go to the Middle East, to Egypt, as he did, but to go out to Southeast Asia, as I try to do, and show something about how, even today, in the southern part of the Philippines, known as Mindanao, and also in Indonesia, there is this ethos which is maritime, not land, which involves cosmopolitan rather than combative ethics, and I think it's part of our exploited, getting back to the first question, exploited, and people use it in negative ways, and you don't recognize anything that is cosmopolitan in it. Of course, there are people who always take the best ideas and try to render them as chivalrous for a campaign. I even think that the idea of saffronization can be used helpfully, but here it's used as the opposite of Islamization. And when we were at Jamaliya this morning, we had a wonderful conversation from Watson, who said, in effect, every time you get two ideologies like saffronization, Islamization fighting each other, you never can have a cosmopolitan convivial outcome. So yes, there is possibility of subverting rather than using correctly all that I've said and all that I feel exists in the Indian Ocean, but I still think we have to work for a cosmopolitan future. Thank you.
Thank you for your insightful lecture and introduction. Now, as a symbol of respect and gratitude, we would like to present a memento to Professor Bruce Lawrence. I call upon Professor Ramakrishnan to present the memento and Professor Bruce Lawrence to receive it. Give him a round of applause.
Good enough? Well, thank you very much. I will be extra baggage with this, but I will gladly take it.
Thank you. Now I call upon Professor Ramakrishnan to give concluding remarks.
What Professor Lawrence mentioned at the end of
under its own tradition of the Punjabi tradition of traveling from the Arabian Peninsula in the southern part and being part of centuries of faith-based traveling networks of people, sometimes forming part of larger maritime world system kind of networks. And the possibility of looking beyond the nation state paradigm as such, so that we could get much more sense of not only our histories, connected histories, the cosmopolitan element within it, but also a sense of, thinking about alternate futures in the sense of not being limited by the extent of parochialisms that you see on several grounds in our midst. It's very important to connect and see those histories in context. And I was delighted that we connected those things with what's happening in the contemporary political sphere, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia. The whole problematic of nation-state that we proposed, and of the majority-minority question, both are linked question, and the possibility of cosmopolitan networks as something that can cut across these kinds of problematic binaries and boundaries. That is a role for us in the academic sphere to look at both histories and politics of our times in a new light. Those who are familiar with Bruce Lawrence's work would know that it's not only about knowing or understanding other religions, for that matter. Sometimes what does this other constitute actually, whether you are being part of it and one cannot completely be part of it if you are studying it or looking at it. But at the same time, some kind of views that are necessary, very sharp edges, which actually discern us to such extent that niceties, those cosmopolitan elements of shared cultures that are very, very significant are lost in the process. And here is some kind of proposition that reminds us of the necessities of rounding off in a larger time scale, but connecting our contemporary situations with that kind of a time scale. It's very important at this juncture, particularly for people like me who is specialized on West Asia and the Middle East, where the presence of Islam are discussed in the contemporary situation in a very, very different context, in a very different situation, very frightening kind of situation, as you know, with the ISIS, with the caliphate, with the war, and so on. And looking at these histories from this kind of a situation requires some kind of academic and scholarly detachment as well. To many people back then, it might be too political to have, but I think we should have both an engagement with the person and looking at our own past with much more authenticity and shared feeling.